Hello. Welcome to the City Club. I'm James Harris, and on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland Special Programs Committee, I welcome you to this discussion on the future of volunteerism in Greater Cleveland. And before we begin, I'd like to ask you to volunteer to turn your cell phones off. Now, apart from that, a strong volunteer commitment to community-based projects and services has shaped Greater Cleveland, and everyone in this room will agree it's vital to our future. To illustrate 2008 to 2010 data, and this includes since the downturn in 2008, on the Greater Cleveland Metropolitan Statistical Area or District, reports that we had 436,300 volunteers. 26.4% of all residents volunteer. That's pretty good. Among them, they contributed 43.7 million hours of service. That's 26.5 hours per resident. The monetary equivalent comes to $933.5 million of service contributed during that period. It's nearly $1 billion over 2 years. And that's just direct, not counting indirect, because every time a volunteer helps with a benefit or does some other kind of function, that nonprofit may end up raising money, spending money, so there are secondary considerations as well. However, there's no guarantee that service-based volunteerism will remain as important to our community as it has been. Evolving multi-generational values, new outcome measurements, and advanced technologies are changing the delivery and effectiveness of community-based volunteerism. For example, the makeup and demands of volunteers have changed. The reliance nonprofits and the community have placed on volunteerism has deepened. They need more, especially since 2008. Pressures from funders on nonprofits to increase effectiveness among the volunteers or the volunteer programs they support are more exacting. Many people in this room know all about outcome management, outcomes. They know about best practices. This is something that is becoming more and more important in the world of volunteerism. Resources to accomplish much needed community-based services are ever harder to find. Ask those in development. Discussing what they've learned and the challenges ahead are three leaders whose organizations supply thousands of volunteers to hundreds of local community-based nonprofits. Joy Banish, the Executive Director of Greater Cleveland Volunteers, and Greater Cleveland Volunteers is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, among many, many other nonprofits, including the City Club, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary. It began as RSVP Cleveland. It runs such programs as Experience Corps, sends volunteers to Playhouse Square, to the smallest nonprofit, does tutoring and education, helps the medical community, very, very wide range of volunteerism. Brian Broadbent, the president and CEO of Business Volunteers Unlimited. Business Volunteers Unlimited hooks businesses into volunteerism. Says to these businesses, be good social citizens, be community citizens, get on these boards, help these nonprofits who can't afford to do everything themselves. And the businesses help, and the nonprofits, of course, are the recipients. Jeffrey Griffiths, Executive Director, Hands On Northeast Ohio. The newest group, although Hands On is certainly a national group that is well known, what they do is they actually try to figure out what these nonprofits need, what they haven't done, and then create programs to fill that gap. 3 different groups, 3 different focuses, all helping with volunteerism. Serving as moderator is Jeffrey L. Brudney, Albert A. Levin Chair of Urban Studies and Public Service at the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. And if you can say that 3 times very quickly. Jeffrey is a well-known expert, not just here, but nationally and internationally. And he was an advisor to the recently released UN report on global volunteerism. He wrote an op-ed piece, in fact, in the Plain Dealer that was published a few weeks ago, a very good one. So having said that, I would now like to turn it over to our first volunteer and the moderator, Jeff.
Thank you, James, and thanks everyone for coming. Always good to see lots of people interested in volunteerism. As James mentioned, I had the privilege of assisting the volunteer program of the United Nations on the first study ever of the state of the world's volunteerism. The report documented the tremendous amount and diversity of volunteerism worldwide. But let's talk about here in Cleveland in Northeast Ohio. In 2010, just to begin with, thousands of you came forward to revamp and reform the government of Cuyahoga County in a volunteer-led effort. A citizen ballot initiative and a set of work groups staffed by volunteers that followed, including a work group on civic engagement that I helped to lead, resulted in massive changes to county government. More practically, as James mentioned, every year in this region, 1 in 4 of you, 25% or more people in this region volunteer for causes of every stripe, of every dimension, from A, arts to Z, zoos, and everything in between, including education, health, homelessness, hunger, justice, library, literacy, recreation, and so forth. Given this level of volunteer help and effort, what can we say about the status of volunteering in Cleveland and Northeast Ohio? Can we take the temperature and gauge the health of volunteering in this region? In short, what is the future of volunteerism in Greater Cleveland? We're here to find out. Let's ask our panel of experts. We know that people are willing and able to help out as individuals, neighbor to neighbor and friend to friend. For this discussion, though, I ask our panelists to confine your answers and comments to formal volunteering to assist organizations and their clients. Let me turn first to Jeff Griffiths and Joy Banish. The information available suggests that we have no shortage of volunteers if organizations are prepared for them and offer the right opportunities. Jeff and Joy, if organizations want to involve volunteers, what do they need to have in place to attract them and to give them a good experience that will keep them coming back and helping the community?
I'll start if you want. Okay. I think one of the things that's most important is that an organization offers a variety of different opportunities to meet the different interests and availability of people that want to volunteer. This would include opportunities that a wide range of skill sets are needed for, opportunities different days of the week, different times of the day, ranging from one-time only opportunities to perhaps a short-term project or even an ongoing opportunity. So I think it's very important that nonprofit organizations really try to develop a wide range of ways to engage volunteers in their organization.
And I would just add to that the overall importance, I think, is that first level of assessment to figure out what those range of opportunities are. So doing that higher level inventory of the needs of a nonprofit organization and being creative about what those needs may or may not be and stretching yourself to think about what those may or may not be. And then being realistic about what the intake, training, and management of those volunteers realistically is and or can be so that you can deliver something to the community and volunteers that is meaningful, makes best use of time, and manages that process effectively enough to retain those volunteers. And we have many great examples of that in this room today. I would say, although to your point, Dr. Brudney, I would say, although the volunteer numbers are impressive, I would say I would challenge all of us to think of how we can stretch that 1 in 4 to 2 in 4 or 3 in 4, and how overall as a community we can think comprehensively and collaboratively about driving more volunteers to meet the most critical needs that will face us in Greater Cleveland. Most agencies do not have volunteer managers, or that position is carried on by the executive director or a principal at a school or a development person, someone who has 12 different roles in addition to that. So the capacity, the training, the funding to equip them to do it well is vital.
Thank you, Jeff and Joy, and we accept your challenge, Jeff, to increase the pool of volunteering and the service they can provide to organizations in this region. Let me turn to Jeff again and to Brian Broadbent and ask them about some of the demographic issues that one gets involved with concerning volunteers. Some people are worried that we're not securing the future of volunteering by attracting young people into volunteering. Brian and Jeff, how can we get more young people to volunteer, and do mandated or required volunteer programs work for this important segment of our population?
I'll start. Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people are worried that the next generation isn't stepping up to volunteering. But actually, statistics show something very different, that the numbers have grown substantially, especially people in that 16 to 22, 24-year-old group, which is great news. Why is that? Well, what's happened in our schools and the sororities and fraternities, people are being asked to volunteer. I've talked to so many different high school students, and some people in the room might even qualify, where you had to put in 20 or 50 hours of volunteerism when you're in high school. Those folks are going on to colleges, trying to volunteer with whatever group that they're getting engaged with from an extracurricular standpoint. And what's interesting from our standpoint at BVU, we find those folks are going into businesses and actually pushing the businesses to say, hey, where can we volunteer, how we can get involved. So I think the future is really bright with the millennials.
I would also say that the younger generations always have been wired and are digital. So continuing to think about ways in that process of recruitment and recognition to use technology in a meaningful way to deepen an issue or a cause or to recognize folks. There are several apps that have come out in the last year, Cause It or Reward Volunteers, which are just starting to do those type of things. So I'd say emphasizing that, and don't underestimate what a younger person can or cannot do, right? As part of that skill inventory of bringing on a volunteer, they may be to add unlimited value. So,
great, thank you. Jeff, we'll return to the issue of social media and volunteering in just a little bit, but I do want to follow up and talk more broadly about the demographics of volunteering. And more specifically, do we have to have different responses, different motivational appeals to engage different groups in volunteering? So I'd like to ask Joy Banish about what it would take to engage baby boomers and perhaps also seniors in volunteering, Jeff to amplify his points on millennial, and Brian to talk about how it is we are going to engage professionals and business people in volunteering. In short, do different volunteer groups call for different strategies to recruit and retain them? So let me turn first to Joy with respect to baby boomers and seniors.
Okay, thank you. The research shows that the highest demographic group that is currently volunteering are the baby boomers. There are more baby boomers volunteering, but they're not giving as much time as the older generation. The older generation most likely is retired, so has more time to give as a volunteer. Some of the differences that we see are with the baby boomers, they're looking for more short-term opportunities. Most of them are probably still employed, so things they can work around their busy work schedule or their family schedule. one-time only, part-time opportunities, short-term projects. They also are looking for things where they can see the impact that they're making through their volunteer activities. Not as interested in doing more menial type of tasks. They want to really be engaged in a project, see it through, know what the results are, and know how their time and energy and talents really made a difference at the organization where they're serving. A lot of the older volunteers, especially we've learned through our work in the last 40 years with primarily focusing on engaging older adults in volunteerism, they also want to know that what they're doing is important and that making a difference. They seem more willing, though, to stick to a set schedule or make a more long-term commitment to an organization. And that's probably most likely due to the fact that they do have more time to give. But also, a lot of it stems from probably their previous work career where they were used to a set schedule and duties and activities that they were responsible for. So in their retirement years, they like to continue with some sort of a schedule along those lines. There are some things to think about, though, as you're working with older volunteers, and depending on their health and their physical abilities, might need to think about, could volunteer opportunities be sliced up into short-term projects, or perhaps the volunteers might need to not have a position where they're standing for long lengths of time due to some physical limitations that they might have. But for the most part, we're finding that people want to help, they want to make a difference, and you just have to find the right way to get them engaged, the right opportunity that meets their personal interests, their passions, their skills that they want to share with the community. And as long as that fits, it seems like people are willing to make the commitment to that organization and that opportunity.
Thank you, Joy. Jeff Griffiths, Millennials, please.
Yeah, in addition to what I previously stated, I had the opportunity to attend a virtual millennial donor conference last year on just engagement of millennials as donors and volunteers. And some of the findings from that conference talked about the want of millennials to have impact, but to have impact with a lot of different charities. So the commitment level may be less, but they may have exposure over more opportunities and organizations. Also, thankfully, I think for the world, you find millennials are more comfortable with diversity and diverse situations, and I think those lend themselves to more opportunities to try different types of volunteerism. So I would say overall, I think engagement across different spectrums and how you cater management is different for different people, but at its core, a good volunteer experience where someone understands the mission and what they're doing to help and is meaningful and making best use of time, that's gonna hit a home run regardless of where someone's coming from.
Okay. Brian Broadbent, can you tell us about professionals and volunteers?
Yeah, I agree with what Joy and Jeff had just said, because it's interesting. Businesses are almost like those individual reactions. If you think of how people volunteer, they can do it at 3 different levels. They can do direct service volunteering, which is what we all think of as far as labor-intensive volunteering. They can do volunteer consulting, where they're using their professional skills, business skills to give back. And they can be board members. And that's almost the highest level. You're at a governance level, and I know there are a lot of board members that are in the room right now, and I'm sure over the radio. And so it's very interesting to think about how you want to participate. So getting into business volunteerism, what BView does is we lay out that menu of options, and each business wants to tackle it a different way, typically because of what the interests are of some committee or some group that's focused on this. But what we found is if you give them a lot of variety and options, that's very positive. There's an interesting statistic that if a person does direct service volunteering, like labor-intensive volunteering, each year about 52% of the time a person will come back and do it again the next year. But if you use their professional skills, 3/4 of the time they'll return. So by having them use almost that higher end volunteering and getting engaged at a higher level, and I would include obviously board positions and such, you're able to keep people engaged, which is what we're all trying to do.
Jeff?
And I would just add to that, you're seeing a national movement of different ways to engage those folks in more skill-based or professional opportunities. You see online platforms like Sparked, which is a free interface where people can find skilled volunteer opportunities, or a movement right now for pro bono and skill-based volunteerism called $1 Billion Plus Change, which has a lot of Fortune 500 companies stretching themselves to make more pledges to give at that more skilled level of impact.
Right.
All right, thank you, panelists. Let me turn to Brian Broadbent and ask him to extend his thoughts a little to talk about the role of volunteerism in economic development and business creation. We know that's a vital issue, not only for Cleveland and Northeast Ohio, but for the nation. Brian, you're exposed to the business sector with respect to volunteer involvement quite a bit. Can you tell us how business might affect volunteerism and the role that volunteers can play in economic and business development?
Sure. The first thing would be the impact business can have. Right now we have 130 businesses working with us, and I mentioned those 3 different levels of volunteerism. So we're putting over 200 people a year onto boards of nonprofits, have 80 teams of people go out and volunteer, and almost 150 corporate team projects. There's a lot of people getting involved in the community, which is huge. So having businesses, most businesses have a strategy to get involved in the community, which is very powerful. And why do they do it? It's because of the brand that it lends to the business. It strengthens the business. And it also does things like help attract people to the business, retain people in the business, and so on, which is very powerful. But it's interesting that a lot of people wonder, and as people are going through our board matching program at BVU, very often we're hearing that people want to get involved with economic development. And there are direct ways you can do that, because there are the teams there's like the Team NEOs and the Magnets, the Jump Starts, those types of organizations, which certainly need help, but they're outstanding organizations directly involved with economic development. But if you think about it, the nonprofit sector itself is an economic engine in and of itself, especially in Cleveland, where we have the clinic, UH, these wonderful institutions that are nonprofit organizations. And getting involved and having people strengthen the infrastructure of those groups, being on the boards to strengthen them, is extremely positive. So all of this is feeding this economic engine. So businesses are encouraging it and volunteers love it. It's something they're definitely asking for.
All right, thank you. Let's continue to look a little bit more broadly to the issues that face this area. I'd like to ask the panelists what other trends and challenges face Cleveland and Northeast Ohio, and in their estimation, what demands are going to be placed on these organizations, and how can volunteers help to meet those demands of the changes and issues that affect this area. Panelists? Jeff Griffith, you want to begin?
Yes, thank you. Certainly, I think in the immediate future is the issue of education, whether it's the transformation plan of the city of Cleveland and the school district, and the role volunteerism can play in that is really transformational. I mean, and again, being deliberate about planning entry points for individuals, groups, parents, to more deeply get involved in the success of the children of our community, I think is just one of the most important and pressing issues that we should all be addressing and thinking about. You know, what would 1,000 more mentors do or tutors do? And what are the barriers from the school district side, whether those are union rules or lack of capacity, that are keeping people from getting in there and providing impact, or after one experience, souring their taste for being involved in a situation like that because it was unorganized and wasted time and wasn't as meaningful. So I would say the role in that transformation plan of parents and community members and neighbors and businesses, and how that is, the access points for that is critical.
Okay.
I'll add.
Joy Banish?
We've been working a lot recently with organizations that are focused on health and nutrition, the anti-obesity effort that the nation is discussing more and more, and a lot of organizations are starting to create programs to make people more aware of healthy eating, exercise, and we've been asked to provide volunteers to help with a lot of the fresh produce distribution programs. We're working with one of our partners on providing volunteers that are going to be doing programs for children to teach them about exercise and healthy eating and nutrition, as far as how to use fresh produce and then bring it home, and ways that they can teach their parents how to use that in their meals. So that seems to be something that's becoming more and more prominent here in our community. And sort of related to it, but not entirely, is the issue, which I think has been ongoing here in Cleveland, but is increasing with the downturn in the economy, is the need for food to help low-income people who are really struggling. A lot of different food pantries and food banks are providing services throughout the county, and they need volunteers to run those. The majority of those programs are run by volunteers. Almost every Meals on Wheels program in the community is run by volunteers, and volunteers deliver the meals to people's homes every day. So everything related to feeding people, making sure they're having healthy, nutritious meals, it seems to be a big activity that's going on in our community lately.
Okay, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, and one of the trends that we're seeing, I'm going to take this question from a little different angle than what you've just heard, and it has to talk about boards. Because coming out of the recession, during the recession, I should say, for a lot of health and human service organizations, the demand for services rose 40 to 50%. There were just huge numbers in terms of the ramp up because of the number of people that are becoming the near poor in the country and in Cleveland and so on. And so what happened then at the same time, it was a perfect storm where all of the different funding mechanisms were decreasing. Government funding, which has been well publicized, endowments went down, so the amount coming off those assets went down. Individual contributions went down 11%. And so for this period of time, the nonprofit sector has really been pushed for their cash reserve balances and so on. So what does that all mean? We really need strong board members to help the nonprofit sector see their way through that. And right now in our organization, we have about 350 nonprofits looking for board members. And they're typically not looking for one board member, they're looking for 5, 10. I mean, it's big numbers of individuals on boards. So there's a lot of help that's required. Secondly, I would just give you a story about an individual who was a person who was very fortunate in her career. She retired at the ripe age of 43. She was a CFO of an international organization that got bought out. And so she was now saying, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? What she decided to do was go work, and she was a CFO, so she used her financial skills to help out a nonprofit. She went in to do a volunteer consulting project with us, helped this nonprofit that really needed to understand their future cash projections, be able to communicate their status more effectively, and so on. She then rolled over to become the interim CFO and then the CFO of this nonprofit and is now the board member of this nonprofit. What I just told you happened over about an 18-month span. So once you get in, she loved the mission of the nonprofit and it has just flourished. But that's the type of impact you can have and really make a difference. And that's what nonprofits are up against, and that's what they need.
Jeff Griffith, another comment?
Yeah, I would just say, piggybacking on what Brian said about the economic downturn, at Hands on Northeast Ohio, we manage projects and see kind of the intimate look at what's happening at agencies, and you see this transition and tightening of the belts that happens from the volunteer management role as well, which really puts a burden on agencies to, again, streamline how they're bringing people in and do it in a meaningful way. So I would just say a challenge that presents us in the future is the funding and the training for agencies to build up their volunteer management infrastructure and the volunteer sector as a whole, so that the executive director who's doing the volunteer management or the principal at the school is at least equipped and the staff feels trained and empowered to make that volunteer experience a good one.
Okay. Jeff had mentioned this idea of the costs and support that goes into nurturing a solid and effective volunteer program. James had told us that in this region, volunteers contribute the equivalent of about $934 million worth of service annually. That finding raises a question. First, is that the true sum nature of the benefit provided by volunteers? Is there something more that they offer? And then secondly, what are the support costs of volunteering? And finally, are volunteers worth that investment? So panelists, what about the overall benefit of volunteers? And then let's turn to the support costs.
I'll say yes, they're definitely worth it. There are some costs involved to having a successful volunteer program. Volunteers, as Jeff mentioned, need to have someone at the organization who is knowledgeable on how to work with volunteers. There's a whole field in volunteer management now, which many people are unaware of outside of the nonprofit sector, but it's actually a career, and you can study to become a professional volunteer manager. And it's important that a nonprofit, whether they're a very small grassroots organization or a huge nonprofit organization, that they have someone there that can take care of the volunteers, someone to properly screen them, train them, schedule them, someone there to say thank you for what they're doing, giving of their time and talents to help that organization. Sometimes volunteers come into an organization and aren't working for the volunteer management person. They're working in a different department. And perhaps those employees there aren't familiar with how to work with volunteers. So it's very important to do a lot of training to all employees that are working with volunteers so that they know how to effectively work with volunteers, make them feel appreciated, but also make sure it's a rewarding experience for them, and that the agency is benefiting from their service.
Very good. Panelists, something further on the support costs and benefits of volunteering?
You know, the benefits, it's interesting. There's a $21 figure for every hour you volunteer. That's the relative value. And when you add up the $934 million, that's the number that's being factored into that. I just want to give another story, another example. There was a friend of mine, Dave Grubb. He's an ex-Accenture partner. I used to work with Accenture for years. And he was willing to volunteer, and he's a real IT pro. So he was asked to go out and talk to an executive team from two organizations that recently merged. And they really had some questions of what to do with their technology. And they laid it all out. They had the roadmap of what they were prepared to do with their technology from a hardware, software support, but they wanted to test it out. So there were 10 people in the room. David came into the room, and they kind of laid it all out. And he sat there, and he saw a train wreck coming. Because basically they hadn't left enough time for the implementation of the technology. And because they weren't going to be able to implement the technology, they were possibly not going to hit some timelines for government grants and some of the foundation grants and things, because they had to have reports done in order to get additional money. Now, if you added up the time David spent in this meeting, it was 2 hours. That was about $42. But he saved them thousands and probably hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the work, because they basically scrapped the strategy that they had and went a totally different direction because of his work.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. And we're going to take a little break here for some mid-announcements. Today at the City Club, we're listening to a special program featuring a discussion on the future of volunteerism in Greater Cleveland. And we'll return to them, so don't worry. And you'll be able to ask your questions. There is a program in front of you. It has guidelines for questions. So please formulate your questions now and remember to be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those listening to our live webcast supported by the University of Akron. For more information about our upcoming forums, to learn how to order a CD or DVD of today's program, or to listen to a podcast of any of our past programs, please visit our website, www.cityclub.org. Again, that's www.cityclub.org. We'd also like to welcome guests today at tables hosted by Business Volunteers Unlimited, Greater Cleveland Volunteers, Hands On Northeast Ohio, and PNC. Thank you for your support. And also in the program, you will notice on the back page, there are lists of upcoming programs, upcoming speakers. The City Club is a center for discourse in a myriad of topics, and on Friday, May 25th, His Excellency Minister Fadi Aboud is going to be speaking on Arab Spring, an insider's perspective. And he will be discussing what we call an Arab Spring and will tell us from his point of view as someone in the region whether anything is really blooming. Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Special Programs Committee members, Doreen Lazarus-Harris, and there she is, and I'm a firm believer that spouses ought to volunteer. And Michael Kallstrom, who is the co-chair of the Special Programs Committee, along with Ellie Sullivan. So, first question.
I'll start out by asking, you referred to millennials. Could you please explain for people listening on the radio exactly what millennials are and what makes them unique, or are they not unique?
It's that age group of, I apologize, that age group of, or generation of folks between the ages of 20 and 35. And I think they're as unique as any generation of good citizens. And certainly in any age demographic, no matter what generation it is, there are situations that people are in that may be different than other points in their life. And I think, again, just being sensitive to those things and identifying what the perspective they're coming from is going to best position an agency to get them in the door.
How do your organizations show the value of the volunteer to the volunteer?
I'll jump in and start, yes. So again, we have a community of volunteers that come to us that we manage through each of our projects. So we have citizen volunteer leaders who at every volunteer project are there to provide a reflection point and a thank you to every volunteer that has impact with us. So directly from us, immediately after a volunteer opportunity, we're presenting to them the impact they just had, whether that's working with a group of veterans or seniors or walking dogs, and or our appreciation of what they had just done to add value to our community. We also send thank you postcards and have recognition events and try to make it as personal as possible, that expression of gratitude. And that comes also then from our nonprofit agency partners who will also provide a sense of thanks for what the volunteers have done.
We do many of the same things at Greater Cleveland Volunteers. One of the other things that we do that Jeff didn't mention is we do ask for feedback from our volunteers. We send out surveys asking for their suggestions on how we can improve our organization and our programs. We also send similar surveys to the nonprofit partner agencies that we work with, asking, again, what they think about the volunteers that we provided, any suggestions that they have that we could help them more, but also how we could improve the way that we deliver services. And I think that is not only beneficial to our organization so that we can do our best work, but it's also a way to recognize the input from not only the volunteers but the agencies, that their opinion is very important.
Brian
If I
Broadbent?
could just add a couple comments. A couple things. Number one is that you definitely can't thank the volunteers enough. I think everybody knows that in the room. So what we do is we try to coach the nonprofits we work with in terms of having programs that can recognize volunteers. And one of the trends I've seen is treating volunteers as employees, where you can give them a review, feedback, solicit their feedback in terms of how the program is working for them, that type of thing, which is very positive. Something that we've had that we've just added to our program is we run the volunteer center, a volunteer center for the city. We had almost 20,000 people use that center last year. And the Cleveland Indians have partnered up to give away baseball tickets. So if you volunteer 4 hours, you get 2 upper box seats as part of the program. And what's nice is that the volunteer organizations are able to get those tickets to their people. So it's some immediate gratification and recognition. And then we've seen a number of our organizations. I'm on the city mission board, and we have a big volunteer recognition dinner where we have 300 plus volunteers in, recognize people who donated over 1,000 hours of time to the mission and so on. And those go a long way in recognition.
I'm always proud of Northeast Ohio in terms of accomplishments, whether it's volunteer or other ways of bringing attention to our area. I'm wondering how Northeast Ohio really compares to other cities that you might know about of similar size, whether it's Columbus, whether it's Milwaukee, whether it's other areas of the country, where we are definitely ahead or a little bit behind. And I know there's different ways of measuring volunteerism, but just your thoughts on how we compare to other cities our size.
I've seen some statistics, this is Brian Broadbent, on this relative volunteerism. Cleveland wasn't as high as I expected it to be. There were some cities like Minneapolis, Salt Lake City, I know Rochester has volunteerism, but it's strong. It's definitely in the upper half of U.S. cities in volunteering. And based on some of the numbers that I think Jeff had talked about earlier, it's very impressive, the hours that are in. But it just wasn't quite as high as I expected.
Is there a reason for that that you can think
I would just say annually there's an inventory by the Corporation of National Community Service called Volunteering in America. And it's a sampling of volunteering across the country that happens and is reported upon every year. Cleveland, in this terms of large cities, ranks and has ranked over the last few years somewhere between that 20 and 24 in volunteers. And this past year ranked 46th out of 51 large cities in terms of volunteer hours contributed by every citizen. And I think that question of why aren't we one or two or fighting Portland and Minneapolis for a higher volunteer rate is really a larger question to our nonprofit sector and to us up here, to challenge us to work in a more dynamic way together to provide barrier-free access for people to get involved and to increase that rate of participation.
I'd like to also add, Jeff mentioned barriers, and I do think that is an issue for some people. Our weather isn't the greatest during half the year, so perhaps that's a problem for some people, preventing them from volunteering. The transportation issues are a problem, especially with people that have mobility issues or older adults or people that don't drive, getting to and from. And to be honest with you, volunteerism actually costs the volunteer money. If you're driving, the price of gas is quite high, so that's an expense. If you're there for several hours, you have to most likely buy a lunch or bring a lunch. Some organizations, you have to purchase a uniform or other items. So there is a cost to the volunteer to give of their time. Hopefully it's well worth it for them, but I think some of those things we just need to keep in mind that they might be preventing people from volunteering that may be interested, and see what we can do as volunteer organizations, but also as a nonprofit agencies. You know, what could we do creatively to break down some of those barriers so more people can give of their time?
Excuse me, about 7 years ago when I first started my job at the Maltz Museum, I did some quantitative analysis on our volunteer group and found out that men generally volunteer to teach and women generally volunteer to learn. And I called around a couple of agencies in Northeast Ohio and I found that to be true. You know, it continued throughout. I'm just wondering if that was something that was really eye-opening. Does everybody already know that? And do you see that as continuing?
Well, I'll mention our organization runs a tutoring program in the Cleveland schools called Experience Corps, and we have quite a few male volunteers. So I think that's, you know, one example of, you would, I guess, stereotypically think that women would be more likely to tutor, especially a young child. But although we have a lot of women volunteers in the program, we do have quite a few men, and men with professional backgrounds. And even sometimes over the course of running this program, we've had people come to us who have had no experience working with children or no experience teaching, and they're not really sure they want to do this, but they're willing to give it a try. And once they get connected, they get hooked, absolutely love working with the children and helping them to learn. So I think that's probably very true.
You were mentioning, Joy, a few minutes ago about some of the barriers that some people experience around volunteering, transportation costs and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious for any of you, how our, unfortunately, over large population of people in career transition is impacting the supply of volunteers. Are those folks who are not employed yet, are they available and interested in volunteering? Can organizations use them or involve them if they're about to get a job and the minute they get a job, they're done? How is that dynamic working right now?
Let's begin with Joy Danish.
Thank you. We have seen an increase in the number of people who are coming to volunteer who are out of work. And it's a great way for somebody who's looking for work to stay connected, to network, to meet new people, to keep their skills up to date, to learn new skills. And they are very dedicated volunteers. When they do find a job, yes, they may need to scale back on their hours, but most instances that we've seen, they've become really involved with the organization where they're volunteering, so they continue to stay involved. They may just need to adjust their schedule or cut back on their hours, but it's a really great way to stay connected and keep yourself busy and make you feel important while you're out of work.
Jeff Griffith?
And I would just add that I think it's that sense of community that can be so dynamic for someone in that maddening process of looking for work. to feel that sense of worth and value, and that you're a part of something larger and can contribute and make a difference, I think is where some of that dynamic impact happens. So.
Brian Bruggen?
Yeah, the other thing I would add is that we've had a number of people come to us because they have been out of work, they've done their initial job searches, and then they hit that lull period where they've done all their networking, they're waiting for things to chill. It's a wonderful time to volunteer. People find it helps build their resume, and it helps them, frankly, get off the couch, get out of the house, and get into the community, and people find it very rewarding. What we've tried to do is team people up on projects, so it's not just one person, so if someone does find a job, there's a team to kind of carry it on.
Curious to ask if the panel would discuss the significance or importance of orientation to volunteers and board members. How effective is it? Where could be improved? Is it necessary? And just any comments on the whole issue of orientation.
Let's begin with Joy Banish.
I think orientation is critical to having a successful volunteer experience. Not only does the volunteer need to learn about that organization where they'll be serving, the culture, the programs, and all the activities that go on, but they also need to be trained on the specific duties that they're going to be performing. And sometimes in the past, we've placed volunteers in an organization and it didn't really work out. And when we talk to the volunteer about why didn't you want to stay there, they'll say they just didn't feel like they had the support. They didn't get enough training so that they knew what they were doing. They felt like they could do a really good job. So I do think it's very important to be able to provide training before the volunteer starts, but then throughout the time that they're with you, keep them updated on what's going on with the agency, with the programs, any trends that are happening. They need to be part of your team, part of your staff, and know everything that's going on there.
Jeff Griffiths?
Yes, I would just add to that, all the volunteers who come through one of our core program models, our managed project program at Hands-On, go through an orientation. And I know that happens with Joy as well at their volunteers. And again, in addition to the points Joy made, I think that setting that level of expectation for volunteers in terms of what to expect from the experience is vital. I will say, though, that when thinking about orientation and training, make sure that you don't make training too cumbersome for the task or job. We've had some animal shelters that have asked people to come back multiple times to get training on cuddling cats or walking dogs. And are all those things necessary, or are they providing, again, another hoop for people to jump through? And or perhaps with some special events or community fests, you might look in ways to communicate that perhaps in other ways. Do you have to come in person? Are there documents or things you can do remotely or on conference call, depending on the task and the type of initiative that it is?
The only thing I'd add is that you just have to do something quickly. When someone gets engaged as a board member or as a volunteer, give them tasks immediately to do. Board expectations should be understood. They should be spelled out. And get them engaged very quickly, because that's when you've got your greatest momentum.
You spoke about the impact of the economic downturn on volunteerism and on nonprofits. Could you talk a little bit about its impact on your organizations? What is the funding, and I'm thinking about it from the funding perspective. You all get funding from a variety of sources. What's the impact been, and sort of what's your outlook on where your funding model might have to change?
I'd love to start. So we were, Hands-On Northeast Ohio was in our 5th fiscal year. We were founded amidst the economic downturn, identifying that there was a need for more intensive management of volunteer opportunities. So as we've weathered the storm and grown through this economy, we've really, our board of directors has had a focus on making sure we had a diversified, strong, sustainable funding stream. We get donations from companies who ask us to help them manage volunteer projects for them. We have individual support and 100% board giving, in addition to foundation support. And we get support from the organization that we pay a membership to, the Hands-On Network, which is, on a national scale, trying to leverage volunteerism in a more dynamic way. So I think sustainable funding for us and being focused with regard to our mission, so that as we grow, we do that with multiple streams of funding.
We've also seen a decrease in some sources of revenue. We historically have had quite a bit of our agency funding from the government funding, and we did receive some cuts in that recently. But we were very fortunate to then be able to raise additional dollars locally from several different sources to offset some of those funding cuts. But it has really made us work a lot smarter, I would say. We now pay a lot more attention to the particular volunteer opportunities that we're trying to place volunteers in, making sure that they're important and providing not only a meaningful experience to the volunteer, but also providing a critical need in our community. And we're doing a lot more with measuring the impact of our services and measuring the impact the volunteers are making, so that then we can say to funders, look, you invested this amount of money in our organization, and here's what we were able to do with that. So I think gone are the days where someone's just going to write you a check and you can do what you want with it. So it's really a whole different way of operating, and it's not just our organization. I think it's every nonprofit's facing that.
If you know any of those folks with checks, though, point them
I
my way,
don't.
From our situation, Barry, we were very fortunate. I fully expected when we got into a significant downturn financially that we were going to be really struggling, because 40% of our revenue comes from business memberships. And in good times, it's fine to fund this volunteering, but when things get tough, businesses would pull the belt a little tighter. That didn't happen. Our revenues actually increased. We had a number of small businesses dropped off, so the number of members went down, but bigger businesses actually increased because, and this is our theory, that they had to have layoffs, they weren't able to pass out bonuses, but for the staff that remained, they wanted to have some very good news for people they could help out in this period of crisis. And so they stuck with their membership at BVU. The second funding source for us, 30% comes from foundations, and they fund what we do on the nonprofit side of the house. And again, I expected with a downturn, health and human service organizations would get money. But in fact, because of the services we provide with the training of the board members, the volunteer consulting, the consulting we do, they stuck with it. And volunteer funding actually held flat during that period. So we were in the black all through the recession.
Jeff Griffiths mentioned the younger volunteers being most comfortable with diversity, and I was hoping the panelists could make some mention of the importance and the value of diversity amongst volunteers united around a particular issue and mission and on boards.
Brian Broadbent?
Yeah, I can start with the boards. Let me start with that right off. It's critical. It's the number one request that we have. I mentioned those 350 nonprofits looking for board members. Literally 90% what they're asking for is specifically racial diversity. Diversity gets beyond that in terms of skill diversity and even geographic diversity and gender diversity and so on. But racial diversity is the number one request that we have. So something that we did, we worked with 6 African American leaders and one of the Hispanic leaders to develop a pipeline of people that go through our board matching program. And in fact, many of our corporate members donated board seats that they could go through for free, which was a very generous program. And so for years, BVU had about 7-8% of the number of people getting elected onto boards were of color, but that number went up into the teens once this program kicked in. We were at 16, 17, even 19 was our high water mark because of this program, but it's still critical demand.
Yeah, this is Jeff. I would say that at any given night, at any hands-on Northeast Ohio project, what you see is a diverse group of like-minded people who care about helping Northeast Ohio. And I think that collection of different points of view, different economic, geographic, just cultural backgrounds is what makes a community rich. It makes an organization rich. It makes a volunteer experience rich. So we try to be as open as possible, and I would encourage any organization to be as open as possible to get as many voices invested in the work that you're doing that can only add value across the board.
Yes, thank you. Till today, I really never thought about volunteerism so structured and so well organized. I thought it was a little bit more loose, but it's certainly not, and it's a tribute to all you. But how important is it for an organization that's seeking volunteers to have a defined set of goals or deliverables for the volunteers?
I'll start. I think it's very important way down to the beginning of a creation of a volunteer position description or a job description that outlines specifically what that volunteer will be asked to do, defines who they're going to be working with, what skills they need to have in order to perform that function there. I think it's critical, but as I believe Jeff mentioned previously, it's also important that the volunteer gets feedback from someone on how are they doing, just like an employee would get feedback. Check in with them regularly, see how they're doing, what concerns or questions do they have. I think it's just critical, because otherwise the volunteer isn't going to be certain that they're really doing the right thing or having an impact that they wanted to have at the organization. So I think it's really important to set goals, what that volunteer is going to be working on, whether it's a project they're doing on their own, or if they're working as a team, what's the outcome of that project. And that way the volunteer feel like they're making a difference and that they really contributed to that.
Jeff Griffith?
I would just add to that oftentimes the person who intakes the volunteers at an entity sometimes isn't the person managing the volunteer for a specific position or job or task, right? So having that position description or that goal, the goals around a specific volunteer opportunity are vital, in addition to the things Joy said, for the success of that volunteer and the success of the staff who will be managing them. If you don't have that investment from those staff, or they don't have the knowledge or training to effectively guide that person through the job, it's going to fall flat for the organization, for the person managing it, and for the volunteer. And that's another volunteer loss potentially, and we can't risk that with all the challenges and needs that we have in the community.
Let me ask one final question of our panelists. We've had a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion here regarding volunteers. And we've had a lot of experience on display to inform our thinking and future thoughts. And again, we're thinking about the future of volunteerism in Northeast Ohio. I'd like to hear from each of our panelists what you thought was the most surprising thing you've learned about volunteers in all your time working with them. What would be the one most surprising thing you'd want to share with this group?
I can start. One of the things that just never really occurred to me was, and there's been a lot of research on it, is the health benefits of volunteering, especially focusing on older adult volunteers. But there's a lot of research that shows that volunteers who serve regularly have seen increases in their physical and mental health. Reduced falls, reduced trips to the doctor, reduced medication use. This research also cuts across all age groups, but that was one thing that was really surprising to me, because you're doing it because it makes you feel good and because you want to help. And another benefit is that it helps your health as well.
Brian Broadbent?
To me, what I hear over and again is life-changing. We actually have a quote from a woman who was one of our board members, and it's a slide that we show as we go around and talk to different businesses about board activities and such. And it was like, it has changed my life. But it's true. And what happens is when people get involved and they find something they're passionate about, and I think the linkage that Jeff or Joy had talked about before is so critical that it can really make a huge difference. And I just think of time I spent. I used to be with Arthur Andersen at Accenture 27 years. But when I look back on those 27 years, the best part of those years was working with our youth group in our church. I mean, the thing that I was most successful doing was working with those kids that was most rewarding. And that's what a lot of volunteers find.
Very good. Jeff Griffith?
And I would say maybe rather than surprising, but I guess the most powerful is the impact that volunteers have every given day. The power that one person or a collective group can have to fundamentally improve a place, a person, a school, a community is just amazing. And to be a part of that, a volunteer experience like that, and to be surrounded by talented, smart, wonderful, caring citizens who want to drive progress and improve the community is what makes going to work every day the best thing in the world.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to a special program discussing the future of volunteerism in Northeast Ohio. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, who are very healthy, open to change, and very involved. We appreciate your volunteering to come here, to listen to this program, and to go out into the community as you do every day. Thank you, and this forum is now adjourned.